We'll roll into the final part of the program. Thank you all very much for sticking with us and contributing. One of the real strengths that we've been able to bring to this is to hear from the senior-most officials from the Australian government. We'll hear next from Jan Adams, AO-PSM, Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Jan was appointed Secretary of DFAT in 2022. Her previous appointments included Ambassador to Japan and Ambassador to China. She was Deputy Secretary of DFAT responsible for economics, and she was a key negotiator for TPP and Australia's FTAs with China, Korea, and Japan. So really right at the intersection of international statecraft and economics. And after Jan speaks, we'll bring up a panel that will look at the next, say, 6 months and what we should all be watching. But let me now invite Secretary Jan Adams to the stage.
Good morning, everybody. My congratulations to the US Studies Centre for putting on such an interesting conference at the right time. And Professor Green, Mike, thanks for inviting me to participate. I know that the conference has already had a lot of speakers framing the big issues, so I'm going to try not to repeat and take this panel as a chance to speak about realities for policymakers, so a bit of a practitioner perspective. But if I start by looking at the title, Reconciling Security and Prosperity, it of course implies a trade-off between two separate objectives. I think on the one hand, at a national level, the two objectives really are codependent. Two sides of the same coin is a phrase often used. A country without security has no chance of being prosperous. This is a point that PNG, for example, makes to us very directly, and is why we're investing so seriously in the security and law enforcement sector in PNG. You might have had a chance to see recent government announcements just in the last days in this area. Conversely, without economic strength, of course, we can't marshal national resources to provide the defence and national security investments that we would like. At a more micro level, however, I mean, there really are often very clear trade-offs. It does feel like a zero-sum proposition sometimes. If you think of something like an airport operations, you can either maximise throughput and economic returns from the terminal investment, or you can maximise security and really slow the whole thing down with a lot of very heavy security screening systems. In these cases where you see really clear trade-offs, it's of course about a balance. It's about optimising security benefits with acceptable or least economic cost, a risk management approach. But I think with more complex areas, you know, the policy areas, foreign policy, international economic policy, to me it seems a bit more helpful to think of a reconciliation as optimising a set of national interest objectives, maximising a complex social welfare function. What that means in practice is that policymakers have to expand the types of factors that are brought to bear on decision-making in any particular area. So for example, if you think about investment policy, the objective isn't just maximising the volume of investment, it's also about meeting other objectives like promoting economic resilience, diversifying global supply chains, investing in net zero transition, investing in trusted partners in critical infrastructure, for example. All of these these decisions occur, of course, against a very complex and, I'd say, increasingly or decreasingly benign international context. I'm sure many people have highlighted that at this conference the fact that geostrategic competition well and truly is including geoeconomic competition these days. I think the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, an illegal, outrageous attempt at changing borders by force, really is a very dramatic example. The geoeconomic consequences of that invasion are stark. The challenges for global food and energy security really impacting developing countries very starkly. And of course the response from Western countries in particular has included economic measures such as sanctions in trade, finance and travel. So the economic and the strategic are well and truly intertwined. Another example of this complex backdrop, of course, is given by the fact that China's rise up the value chain, up the technology chain, means that geostrategic competition is also economic and technological competition. And my point here really is that the international context is already fusing security and economic issues all the time. So it follows that our decisions on economic policy matters or security matters that have international dimensions necessarily have to take this backdrop into account. So you're not just maximising for one variable, but a set of interconnected variables. As I said before, as a practitioner, I think what that means sort of at a bureaucratic level is that there really is a premium on breaking down those silos, on being as connected bureaucratically as we can be. And I think that's absolutely what we're seeing in reality. I want to give 3 examples of where from a foreign policy point of view, we're actively integrating various strands of policy work across government. First I mention is the China relationship. I've just come from spending 3 days with Premier Li Qiang through his 3-city tour. It's been an important few days. Of course, needless to say, the China relationship from Australia's point of view is extremely important, but it's not what you'd call straightforward. While we want to foster and pay attention to the economic relationship, there are many more factors that we're also taking into account. I've mentioned a few of the obvious ones. Diversifying global supply chains, critical minerals is the obvious sector where this is just so important, and I know there's been a lot of discussion about that at this conference. Data security, cyber security, critical infrastructure. Australia is being clear to China that we are paying attention to these objectives as well as, of course, the set of other foreign policy issues, including rule of law, international rules, the importance of international rules, including UNCLOS, including WTO, South China Sea, defence behaviour, alignment with Russia, the whole lot. My second example is Southeast Asia. This is a region, of course, so important to Australia as our neighbours. Our overall view is that if we want to have a strategic equilibrium, if we want to have a balance in our region that avoids one country dominating or any country being dominated, then Australia needs to play its part in providing options for these countries to be a partner. Now, I mean, I know very well, I'm sure everybody here does, that economic development, trade, investment issues are just central for the national development priorities of our neighbours, Southeast Asian countries. And so therefore we have to make an offering on those terms. That's why we've put so much investment into our Southeast Asia economic strategy. I think some of the things we've been able to get government support for really show the commitment to doing this seriously. For the first time, we have Export Finance Australia, DFAT, Industry Department, Austrade working deliberately very together in teams with business to see what else we can do to play our part as an economic partner in the region. Of course, investment has to be done on its own, it has to make economic sense in its own terms, but nevertheless we think as government that if we pay some more deliberate attention and see what can be done that makes sense from corporate objectives and economic objectives, as well as our interest in providing economic partnership options for the region. And my last example is the Pacific. You might think that a foreign and trade ministry responsible for aid would be focused on only things like education and health issues, as well as those classic development areas in the Pacific. These days, however, the kinds of things that we're doing with our Pacific Island country neighbours really span the entire security, economic development, climate change spectrum. I think the Falapila Union with Tuvalu is a classic, well, not classic, actually it's a very unique example where we're addressing the existential threat of climate change by offering first ever mobility pathway. I just picked that example as one perhaps most dramatic, but my point is it's a serious whole of government effort, involves immigration, border force, agriculture ministries, industry ministry, AFP, defence, as well as trade and development and various social policy areas. I'm going to finish with two comments about Australia's role in supporting others' economic security. And here I'm thinking in particular, not just because of my panel partner, I can't see, Japan, but bottom line, energy security is also national security. And Australia's role in providing reliable energy security to particularly our North Asian partners, including Taiwan, I think is a really significant contribution to regional economic security that perhaps people don't always think of when this debate comes up. And lastly, I back in what my trusted deputy George Mina said yesterday about Australia's role in continuing to support rules-based approaches wherever we can. WTO fundamentally, of course, but also other opportunities for like-minded rulemaking such as IPEF or other particular approaches on, for example, digital trade, data security, etc. So a big role for Australia, already a lot of integration occurring, and I think this is going to be of ever increasing significance as we deal with the challenges ahead. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Jan. always enjoy hearing you speak because you're the only person in Australia who calls me professor. I can't even get my students at University of Sydney to do that, so thank you once again. But really because of the insights you bring from the front lines of Australia's diplomacy and economic statecraft. Very much appreciated. I'm filling in for Peter Dean, Dr. Peter Dean, who's the director of our Foreign Policy and Defense Program. He has been felled by one of these things that's going around, and sorry he can't make it, but I will do my best to stand in for him. We are in the 9th inning. And I have to use a baseball metaphor and rise in defense of baseball after Helen Mitchell. Is Helen here? I would point out it is dangerous to attack baseball in a room full of not only Americans, but also Canadians, Koreans, and Japanese. But I will reciprocate by starting with a cricket metaphor. I think it's a cricket metaphor, the only one that's made the mainstream lexicon in the US, which is sticky wicket. That is cricket, right? And this is a sticky wicket. This whole set of issues is a tricky one. So we have a panel joining Jan that will help us unpack it for the end of the conference. And as I said earlier, really help us anticipate what we should be watching in the months ahead. So Yasuo Takamura is cabinet counselor for the National Security Secretariat, the NSC staff in Japan. He started there in 2021 and served before that in the Asia Development Bank, originally from the Ministry of Finance, and a graduate of Todai, Tokyo University, and UC Berkeley. Senator Dave Sharma is the senator for New South Wales, representing the state in federal parliament since last year. He represented the seat of Wentworth in the House from 2019 to 2022. Before that, he had a career in business and as a diplomat, an ambassador in Israel, but we first met, I think, when you were in Washington, and I was in the White House at the time. And you all remember Liz Economy, who is from the Hoover Institution and one of America and the world's preeminent experts on China and the Indo-Pacific. So I might start with you, Takamura-san. Last night at dinner, I asked 3 of Jan's colleagues, whether Australia needs, like Japan or Korea, or the US really, an economic security, well, in Japan's case, minister with legislation. In the US case, coordinators in the NSC. They artfully avoided the question. And maybe it's not needed. But I think people would be interested in the experience that Japan has had since passing a national economic security law, creating the ministry, your position within the Prime Minister's office. What lessons have you brought that not only Australia, but the US, Korea, Canada, and others can take forward?
Okay. So first of all, I'd like to thank USSC for inviting me to this wonderful panel. The title of the panel is Economic Security in a Turbulent World. This is a central issue I have been pushing for since I assumed my position 3 years ago. At the time, I was tasked to conceptualize economic security and to compile a set of new policies which are considered necessary under the new concept of economic security. So in the beginning, I remember that I got a lot of questions what this means, because economic security was a kind of newly coined word in Japan. But I think it was not so difficult to get people understand what it means, because at that time people already had realized that our supply chain had become too complicated without due consideration to the geopolitical risk, and also rapid innovation, technological innovation can cause the risk of being abused or misappropriated by malicious actors. So I was assigned 3 years ago, and then current Prime Minister took his office in October 2021. And what he did first was to set economic security as one of the top policy priorities. And then, as you said, for the first time, he appointed the minister in charge of the economic security in Japan. And at that time, I recall that the Secretary John, then ambassador to the Japan, you made a quick courtesy call to Minister Kobayashi at the time. I was in the meeting, so it's very nice to see you again here. And then the Prime Minister Kishida instructed my team to come up with an overarching legislature to cover the economic security issues. And that is the Economic Security Promotion Act, ESPA. I think Professor Suzuki-san already mentioned that. So this act is a kind of the landmark legislation in Japan, which enable the government to take various economic measures across the sectors. So this was based on the whole of government approach, and we created the office to implement this new legislation. The new office is composed of more than 60 staff now, and they are now implementing this legislation. So one of the main features of this new act is to enhance the supply chain resilience. So with this new legislation, we have identified 12 materials as critical to our national security and safety of our people, including the semiconductors, critical minerals, and the ingredient of the antibacterial drugs, something like that. And we could secure around 2 trillion yen, that is approximately 20 billion Australian dollars. So that is quite significant, given that this money is provided to the private sector. So that is one remarkable progress with this act. And also technology, let me also mention technologies. So in late 2022, Japan formulated a new national security strategy. And we put one paragraph titled the main elements of our national powers. And we listed 5 elements consisting of our national powers. First is defense. The second is diplomatic capability. These two are very easy to understand because they are considered basic tools to promote the traditional national security. But in addition to these 2 elements, we also added technological capability and economic capabilities and information capabilities. So we listed 5 elements. And this means that the national security, the scope of the national security has already expanded to economic and technological areas. So that means that we need to take a more holistic and integrated approach to tackle the national security issues. So given the importance of the technologies, we newly started the government-funded program, which is dedicated for development of the dual-use technologies, such as marine, space, AI, or quantum. So for this program, we could secure around 5 billion Australian dollars, and we are now doing a lot of open calls for these projects. And the main feature of this project is that each project will be implemented under the close communication between the public and the private. So the researchers can exchange views with the relevant ministries, including the Ministry of Defense, so that we can ensure the smooth collaboration between the public and private. So, but these are the major progress. But as you said, we are facing a lot of challenges. So let me also mention the challenges we are facing. So in terms of the supply chain resilience, so this act is effective to some extent. But basically, this is a subsidy to the manufacturing companies. If they expand their factory, we can provide 1/3 of their additional cost, new investment. But this is just a supply side policy. Even with this generous grant, they sometimes feel reluctant to expand their production capability because they are not so sure about the future demand. So in case of the critical minerals, they need to ensure that long-term offtake would be ensured over the long term. Otherwise, they still feel some reluctance to expand their capability. So what we are trying to do is, so one possibility is to collaborate among the like-minded partners to create a common market, which are differentiated from the supply chain consisted of the unfairly poor prices. So last week, the G7 Leaders Summit was held in Italy, and we put one paragraph. Let me read out that para. Where is it? I'm very sorry. So yes, this one. So recognizing that economic resilience requires de-risking through diversification and reduction of critical dependencies, including those resulting from overcapacity. We will implement the principles on resilient and reliable supply chains. So we put this paragraph because we feel the need to collaborate more to create a common market. So one possibility is to introduce some international qualification or certificate system in providing the subsidy to consumers or in government procurement. So I think we need to think about the demand side policy in addition to the supply side policy. That is one lesson learned. And also the technologies. So we started a new program dedicated for the dual-use technologies. But this is just a government-funded program. At some point, this program will come to an end. And most likely, the outcome of these programs would require the further financing for commercialization. So we definitely need to mobilize the private money. We need to make more efforts to crowd in or unlock the private capital to develop our new technologies. So in that regard, so Secretary Adams mentioned the regional security in an early speech. So we are now pushing for the Quad Investors Network. This network was launched in parallel with the Quad Leaders Summit a year ago. And this is basically driven by the private sectors, but we are very supportive for this because this is trying to facilitate the investment in such a critical and emerging technologies across the 4 countries, Australia, Japan, US, and India. So, we are very supportive for this initiative, and we need to make such continuous efforts to mobilize private money. So let me stop here.
No, excellent. Thank you, Takamoto-san. I really, in particular, take your point about Japan's holistic approach, very deliberately having a national security strategy before a national defense strategy, and then an economic security strategy, which is a bit of a contrast to both the US and Australia. I'm pretty sure the Biden administration put its technology and economic security strategies out before the national security strategy. I guess Australia on writing hasn't formally done either yet, maybe doesn't have to. But I do remember when Abe-san, as Prime Minister, created Japan's National Security Council,
Yes.
Your ministry wasn't in it. The finance ministry was not in it. METI was not in it. It took some time for, really until Suga and then Kishida-san to realize we can't have a national security strategy without key representatives from Ministry of Finance, METI, and elsewhere. I was going to ask you if you're getting along with your foreign ministry and METI colleagues, but I assume the answer is yes. And quickly, if I could, The Quad Investors Network is very interesting. I've been to some of the meetings. I think it's fair to say there's more enthusiasm in Japan and Australia than there is in the US, so there's some work to do on the US side. Are there other mechanisms, because when you talk about the importance of the supply side, of crowding in funding, that really depends on a very exquisite understanding of the private sector's strategies for capital allocation and risk and so forth. Quad Investors Network is more, it's a grouping, it's a group. Do you have other mechanisms to talk to business and to get those answers as you develop policy?
Well, so apart from the Quad, we are also pushing the trilateral cooperation among the Korea, Japan, and the US. And what we are doing is to encourage the coordination among the national labs among the three countries. So each country has a renowned national institute, right? But there has been less coordination as desirable. So we are now pushing them to collaborate with each other. But I think this is a network of the collaboration among the researchers. But I suppose that would lead to the better coordination among the business people or private companies. So that's another example.
Thank you. Dave, you've had the opportunity, the battle scars of serving in government, parliament, and the private sector. So you're sort of versed in all three. Sitting now in the Senate, do you think Australia or Australia's friends are organized, fit for purpose, have the right priorities? What would you emphasize over the coming year?
Look, I was struck hearing from Takamura-san just how much work Japan has gone into defining some of these economic security objectives. I mean, piece of legislation, an office, 12 particular materials or sectors identified. Australia doesn't have a tradition, we don't have a strong political tradition of doing big overarching statements. I mean, we did have a national security advisor in Australia about 12 years ago who was meant to deliver an annual national security statement, but the experiment largely failed and it withered on the vine. And so we tend to have piecemeal statements. We have the Defence Strategic Review. Every few years we'll have a foreign policy white paper. But we tend to set policy more through the accumulation of decisions rather than through a grand strategy. But I think there's a question certainly to be asked, is that still an approach that's fit for purpose, given a less predictable, less benign external environment and less ability to rely upon a liberal trading order? And we heard, there's this phrase that Stephen Kennedy used yesterday. I think it originally came from Jake Sullivan about small yards and high fences and the need for us to determine what's in the yard. And at the moment, I think those decisions about what's in the yard and what's not, they're sort of happening largely without an overarching framework. They're happening by discussions between ministries and departments around the National Security Committee of Cabinet table. It doesn't mean that process is not working well, but if you sit from the outside or in public and say, well, is this in the small yard or not? You wouldn't know necessarily. I mean, we've got solar panels, for instance, which is a kind of a hallmark of the Made in Australia policy. We're going to have an Indigenous or national solar panel manufacturing industry. Now, a lot of people would say, well, we don't know. Personally, I'm sceptical about whether we need to have sovereign capability in the production of solar cells. But then you might take semiconductors. I mean, should we go and try and build a semiconductor fab in Australia or attract TSMC or something to do so? I would say absolutely not. But again, we haven't had that sort of discussion. So I think there's certainly a case to be made. It would be difficult, given our political culture, to say let's do legislation, let's create a new ministry, let's create a new department. But I think some sort of overarching statement that tries to meld these sort of two things together, our external interests, our national security interests, but our economic interests as well. And I don't think we have that architecture yet. So I don't necessarily have a prescription of what that would be. It might be as simple as a speech by the Prime Minister or statement to Parliament. But I think we could do with a bit more guidance, and particularly our private sector could do with a bit more guidance, because they're not part of these discussions that are happening behind closed doors. But big investment trade and other decisions hinge upon how we are defining what's critical for Australia, where do we need to either de-risk or diversify or create sovereign capability, and what are we prepared to rely upon, current trading relationships to provide to us.
Liz, I'd be interested in your views on what you've heard on the panel so far, having the experience designing these strategies with Secretary Raimondo in Commerce. But also I wanted to ask you about, well, throughout this conference, we've heard frequent reference to the large country that starts with C, or we've heard reference to this sort of, amorphous, not incorporeal form of coercion that comes from somewhere, or we've heard about China, usually from the Americans. So I'd be interested in your views, but also give us a quick, what should we be watching in Beijing? We're talking about a lot of strategies that affect Beijing's equities. What do you expect China to be doing? Is it sort of what we've seen? Do you think there will be more caution with the U.S. election? Do you think some of these measures we've talked about in this conference will lead to learning and new strategies on Beijing's part? What should we be watching on China?
Yeah, I think there were a lot of different questions there. Let me start. I think, Emily kind of sketched out the different strategies that China has. It can do workarounds, right? It can compete head on. It has a lot of different mechanisms, invest more. I think what I'm looking at right now, what's top of mind, I think with China is probably the third plenum if we're thinking about economics and economic strategy moving forward for China. And, third plenums typically, well, not typically, but can become the sort of place where big announcements are made. It's where Deng Xiaoping made his big announcement about reform and opening. It's where Jiang Zemin made the big announcement about SOE reforms, state-owned enterprise reform. I don't expect that this is going to be that kind of third plenum. It's already been a year delayed. Should have happened last fall. And I was in Beijing in April, and the reason that was given was that there was a lot of difference of opinion. It was a kind of a divided government when it came to sort of future economic strategy. I think what we're likely to see coming out of China in the third plenum, and I heard two radically different things from two economists, I would say. One said, this is just going to be Xi Jinping manifesto, basically cementing and lauding everything that has come before with Xi Jinping. Another one said, no, we should expect a big announcement on green transition, on climate, and how we're going to meet our 2030 and 2060 goals. And so I would say there's going to be something big, probably, since I heard this from a pretty senior official, something big on climate. But beyond that, I think it's going to be largely what we've heard before, namely doubling down on technological self-sufficiency as and indigenization as a mechanism for addressing the challenges that they feel emanating from the United States and some partners and allies with regard to export controls and everything that's going on now with Russia as well. I think the whole new productive forces, it's going to be EVs, and Xi Jinping has made this clear, EVs, energy storage, batteries, and then the AI plus, sort of integrating AI throughout the entire economy. That's going to be another big priority. What would make it interesting would be if you began to see, and then probably some more stuff around real estate and trying to address that, because so far what they've announced is a very small amount of central government funding to local governments to buy up empty apartments and turn them into low-cost housing. And even the Chinese economists say it's nowhere near enough to address this huge problem. So that I think we're going to see. What would make it interesting would be, initiatives that would address the problems with consumer demand. Are we really going to see anything that's going to, address the pension issue, the health, education, sort of the broader social welfare issues that, Chinese people want to see taken care of, right? Real reform in this sector that will enable them to spend more money and not have to save to take care of all these other issues. I think that would be a big thing. I think for foreign enterprises, for multinationals, China announced maybe August of last year the sort of 24-point plan that was supposed to encourage foreign investment back into China. 2023 marked a 30-year low in FDI for China, and I don't see that changing.
Yeah.
And the Chinese now say they've implemented 60% of the 24 action measures. I don't even think that's true, but beyond that, I don't see a big surge in multinational interest to go back with, I mean, some sectors, yes, but, so I'm not looking, I don't think we're gonna see a big new announcement that's gonna be a game changer, either for the Chinese people or for multinationals. Again, because I also think the real weight of Xi Jinping is on control, and it's on the security apparatus. It doesn't matter if you pass these 24 provisions and then you talk about Western consultancies, they're spy agencies, right? It doesn't matter if you're doing 24 provisions if you're constraining all the flow of economic information and businesses can't get the data that they need to make good decisions. So I just don't think he is prepared to make the kind of changes on the ground that would actually incentivize business to come back.
So to Dave's earlier point about Australia not doing lots of big pronouncements, I was a little embarrassed because in the Pentagon and the White House, I've written more than I can keep track of, and maybe they didn't matter. But when we wrote them, certainly in the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations, we sometimes very deliberately said that our actions, whether it's economic policy or defense or diplomacy, were aimed in part to shape China and China's choices. Liz, I wanted to ask you, I think I know the answer, but we've heard a lot the last 2 days about protecting key technologies and so forth, partnerships, and then promoting investments. In a sort of zero-sum way, none of this is good for China. And one would think it might shape their decision-making, that maybe the dual circulation and the statism and the parties crackdown and all the rest is actually, that in the trade-off between security and economics, China's way too heavy on the security side. I think I know the answer, but is there any prospect of some of the actions all of the countries represented here are taking that somehow within Zhongnanhai there will be a wait a minute moment, or not likely?
I think Xi Jinping started China on the track toward dual circulation before all these policies started being, pushed out of the United States and allies and partners. And indigenization of technology has been there for decades. It's nothing new. So I think what these policies have done is to accelerate China's drive in this direction. Is there an aha moment? I think that there is debate. Again, I think that's part of the reason that you've had this delay in the third plenum. I think there is debate among the economists, certainly, but I think that Xi Jinping has his own vision for how he wants to move forward. And so I think there are plenty of aha moments among the liberal reform economists. Aha, this is really bad what you're doing. Aha, that's really bad. Aha, this is super bad. So I think they all get it, but I don't think they have any real influence or power to change the overall direction. So that's my assessment of where things stand.
And probably for Xi and certainly the Central Monetary Commission or those in Zhongnanhai around him, everything they see has a confirmation bias. Aha, see? The Americans, the Japanese, Australians, they're exactly as we thought. Yeah, a bit of that probably going on as well.
Yeah, I'm sure that is also true.
So Jen, you've served in Japan and China. I welcome your thoughts on what you've heard. Might also ask about one topic in this conference, which is the system we benefited from, the Bretton Woods system, the WTO. Are there parts that are particularly worth focusing on and saving? So feel free to comment on anything you've heard, but interested in that, because your career you've lived in that world. And it's still alive, barely. So what's your thought on how we preserve the good in the system that we don't think is working?
Okay, thank you. Maybe if I could, I just want to come back to Takamura-san's presentation. We of course congratulate Japan on all of these big reforms actually in your system, and I know it's taken a great amount of political and bureaucratic work. You were kind enough to mention, but of course Australia and Japan have been working, we've been working really closely on these issues for a few years now. I think, you have to remember where systems start from. So part of what Japan has been introducing are things that we have had embedded in our systems for a long time. So security clearances is the classic example. So we've been able to, you know, work with you, and I know I've had many really important conversations with Amari Sensei leading the work in the DFAT, as well as Akiba in NSS. So, you know, introducing more strict information security, like protecting government information, introducing security clearance systems, having trusted business partners with security clearance to bring into the national security debate. They're things that we've had in our system for a long time. Likewise, on cybersecurity, we're doing a lot of cooperation there. But again, Australia has, we don't talk about it so much because it's in our system, it's just embedded. Well, actually, we do have a cyber strategy that's new. So there's a nice new big document
there you go.
for you with the word strategy in the title. But, you know, we've been doing that for a long time. Likewise, critical infrastructure, the SOCI Act, do you remember when we introduced the critical infrastructure security legislation?
2018, I think.
2018. So it's in the framework, and Canberra's a small place. It's easy to coordinate. We all know each other very well. It's a organic daily process at all levels, from ministerial right down to working level. So we kind of work these things all the time. We don't think you need to say in headlines that you're doing this. We just do it. It's really integrated into mentality in our system. Like, nobody does single issue work anymore. National security agencies are involved in economic issues and vice versa, and everything in between. So I really think you have to kind of remember where systems started from when we're talking about this, the bureaucratic or not just bureaucratic, but the administrative architecture. I really enjoy. I always love hearing the China analysis, but I'm in I feel constrained in commenting given my position, but it's really interesting to follow, and I haven't found anything to disagree with, let me put it that way. What did you ask me specifically?
The pieces of the order that benefited us all,
right.
the WTO,
right.
TPP, the rest of it.
Thanks.
Because in your talk, you did speak about trade agreements, but it was very
briefly at the end. I was taking up too much time, so I cut myself. Look, I think it's easy to say, oh, it's all withered and it's all irrelevant, and I know you did that just to be provocative. But the reality is that most of the global trade still happens on the basis of WTO commitments. So those tariff bindings, mostly, of course, there are some extremely notable exceptions, but the vast bulk of global trade is continuing predictably based on those now embedded structural rules. So it's still the whole underpinning of the global economic system. So I don't think you can, of course there are real problems, and the dispute settlement mechanism in WTO, which is it's the only international agreement that ever actually managed to have binding dispute settlement. It's perhaps not surprising that it's come under strain when particularly major countries don't like outcomes of binding dispute settlement. There's a reason that they don't bind themselves to rules in the first place, isn't there? So I think it's easy to kind of overrate the damage that's been done. There's no doubt the system's under strain. There's no doubt that international rules across the board are under strain from the UN Charter down. But the bulk of our economic activity is still occurring in accordance with WTO and our the networks of free trade agreements that we all have and our investment agreements. So what bit is still important? All of it is absolutely fundamentally important. I mean, Australia's, decades-long, regardless of which major party is in government, position on the importance of rules-based system for a medium-sized country. That doesn't change. The national interest doesn't change because of actions of others. It's still our interests, and that's what we will still look for ways to support, rules-oriented approaches to issues. Because if it's a pure power-based approach, then of course it's not where Australia wants to be.
Or many other middle
us.
powers in the system.
Correct.
Yeah. Takamura-san, my first job in government was in the Japan desk of USTR at the height of the wonderfully enjoyable US-Japan trade wars. And I, at a very young age, negotiated things like the tennis racket market and the garbage disposal market, and failed to open any of them. But anyway, it's remarkable how Japan has transformed. At that point, Japan had no FTAs. It was in Bretton Woods, of course, but had no FTAs with Australia or TPP or anything like that. Today, 85% of Japan's trade or more is covered by FTAs and EPAs. Japan's average tariff rate now is less than half the US. It's amazing. The US, by the way, is half of the EU. Just we're not totally lost yet. So it's just been a remarkable transformation. And I'll quote my friends at Lowy. Lowy Institute had a report a few years ago that said Japan is now the leader of the neoliberal order in Asia, sort of as America stepped back. So how does that look in the Prime Minister's office, in your secretariat, as you do economic security? How do you answer the question I asked Jan? How is Japan trying to preserve things like the WTO and the international trading rules that we once fought over?
So thank you very much for that great question. I think to maintain the rule-based international order is critical for Japan. Japan needs to rely much of their energy or food on foreign countries. So we definitely need to keep the rule-based international order. So for that purpose, we need to deepen the collaboration with like-minded countries, including Australia. What Secretary Adams stated earlier is truly, exactly true. When we formulate the ESPA, Economic Security Promotion Act, we fully learned the practice of Australia, how they are protecting the critical infrastructure. And also, recently, the good news is we could pass a new legislation to introduce security clearance in the economic areas. And also, that was also inspired by Australia. We also went to your agency and we learned what Australia is doing in that respect. So I think this is a mutual learning process so that we can enhance our policies respectively, and also we can collaborate, we can deepen our collaboration to preserve such international, rule-based international order.
Dave, I'm going to give you the last, maybe hardest question. And it's not fair to ask current serving diplomats and officials this question, but you're fair game. Because in Parliament, in the Senate, you can be asked anything or ask anything. In fact, you can ask anything and send an estimate. So this is payback on behalf of Canberra. The US election. I'm not asking you to predict who will win, how good or bad it'll be, but how should Australia or Japan or Korea or Canada or other US friends think about what comes next, 2025, and building an agenda around the issues we've been talking about? You've served in Washington during a more sane administration, if I may say so myself. But what do you recommend for business, for government?
Well, I think, look, there's a bit of a tendency in the media to, amongst commentators, to sort of catastrophize the possible outcomes, right? And I don't think, I certainly don't think that makes sense if you're not an American citizen, if you live abroad. I think we should expect and anticipate and proceed on the basis that we will have a regular, functional mutual interest-based relationship with whoever's in power in Washington, D.C. And I think by and large, that will be the case. There will be, theatrics with any new administration, and there will be a whole lot of speculation that something is about to, and particularly if it's a Trump administration, of course, there'll be speculation that the blueprint from Heritage will be implemented and all these sorts of things will be overturned. I don't think that's particularly likely. I think that we'll see a lot more continuity in our relationships. And I think just as with any new administration, any government around the world, I mean, I was there for the transition from Bush to Obama, and we didn't know Obama was going to win the election. We prepared for a potential McCain administration, a potential Obama administration. But you sort of get your house in order. You've got your proposition about what do we bring to the relationship, why are we a valuable partner, what are the most important issues we need to work on together. And they're not emotional appeals. I mean, there's always a bit of that, appeals to shared history and culture and values, but usually they're interest-based appeals, that this is where we work together, this is what we bring to the relationship, this is why it's important. And I think any administration in Washington, when it looks to the Indo-Pacific, will see the enduring importance of relationships with Japan, with Korea, with Australia, with the Philippines. It will see the benefit in honouring its security commitments and being seen to honour its security commitments, including to Taiwan. And I think they'll recognise that, stability in those relationships will be important. So, I think we need to make sure that when we engage with a new administration in Washington, when any country does, we take a sort of a rational approach to it and don't get caught up in a whole lot of the high emotion that will inevitably accompany that election, the result. And who knows, I mean, potentially some drama after the result if it's a highly contested or close vote. But I think we need to make sure we steer clear of all that sort of stuff, wait till a new administration's in office and then just proceed in an orderly fashion.
Sound words. My go-to line on US politics is what Mark Twain said about the music of Richard Wagner. It's not as bad as it sounds. Well, bottom of the ninth, 4 home runs. Thank you. Please join me in appreciating our audience.
Thank you, everyone. That was fantastic. So now we're, as Mike said, bottom of the ninth, we're closing up. So we're going to do quick results of our polling from yesterday and today. And so I'm going to ask my colleagues now to show the results. Now, that number is the average score divided by, so basically the score is divided by the number of people in the room. So you can see we have not changed many hearts and minds, but in terms of our #1 ranking, but you can still see there is some movement beneath that. As a think tanker, it would be remiss of me to not highlight that that's just the bolded section of the option. We flagged when we asked people, we asked you these questions: military conflict or the use of gray zone economic and technological coercion by another nation to undermine sovereignty and security. So my question is, has that already started in terms of undermining sovereignty? Are we seeing that now? Again, this is for the Indo-Pacific more broadly. This is not Australia. And I should note the difference between thinking about or asking elites versus asking the public. When you ask the public what are their most important foreign policy challenges in the US, war, conflict, last Pew poll had it at 1 or 2%. In Australia, they haven't, the sort of most important problems, war is not up there, though the polling is not as similar. And I guess we can go to question number 2 to see the results. Economic slowdown in Australia. And I find this really fascinating in the way that it is significantly higher than it was for the Indo-Pacific more broadly. So it seems like this room is more concerned about economic slowdown in Australia than it is for state conflict, than it is for paralysis and dysfunction, or climate change. This actually aligns very neatly with where most Americans and most Australians think in terms of economic slowdown being a top concern. I wonder, however, if we asked Americans or Australians about foreign policy challenges or economic security challenges, whether this would be the #1 as well. There's a, what we do at the US Study Center is we try to ask a lot of tough questions, but also we try to move beyond just the hypothetical, but actually force people to take some tough decisions. One thing that I think of is in a state conflict, perhaps involving Taiwan, we like to think of that as an on-off switch, it's a military dynamic, it's not an economic one whatsoever. I would hope today and yesterday we've learned that the dynamics in the region are far beyond military, but actually involve some economic dimensions. If we look at, for example, what's happening in Ukraine, it's a lot easier to isolate what John McCain called a gas station with nukes, which is Russia, than it is to isolate the #1 trading partner of over 100 countries in the world. And so I would think that economic slowdown, this is a fun exercise, but I would think that economic slowdown is actually related to state conflict as well, where I'd hope that people start to understand the dynamics there. Then we can move on to number 3. Supply chain diversification. Remaining number 1, but 2 and 3 switching places over the course of one day. We've asked folks at the USA Center, we've done some polling on whether people in the US, China, and Australia would want a phone not made in China. So US, Japan, and Australia, we asked respondents, over 1,000 people in each country, do you want a phone not made in China or made in China? 90% of folks in each country want a phone not made in China. Then we said, all right, how about you put some skin in the game? What if we had a phone that was $500 more expensive? Would you still want a phone not made in China? And 2/3 to 80% of respondents in all 3 countries still want a phone not made in China. Now, that is something you say in a poll. That doesn't mean at the store, at the Apple store, they'll say, yes, I want that phone that's $500 more expensive. But that to me tells me that this supply chain diversification is something that the publics across all 3 nations, and I imagine across the G7 as well, really do see as something that is significant and that they actually are, at least hypothetically, willing to put some skin in the game. So with that, I will close and hand off to John, and thank you so much for indulging us in this polling.
Thanks, Jared. Thanks to you and also to Paul Weeks for all the work that went into doing that and the tech, as I said, not my wheelhouse. Look, I'm not going to be one of those people at the end of a conference that tells you what you've just heard for the last day and a half. I've heard a few of those. You probably all have. I want to start really just by thanking all of our speakers, particularly our international speakers. I was sort of expecting at some point, whether via email or a Zoom, someone was going to say, what, you want me to travel 24 hours for a 20-minute speech? Or you want me to travel 9 hours for a 10-minute panel? Everyone was so polite. But in the end, we were able to stretch their time with, I think, a fantastic group of international guests. So will you join me in thanking our international speakers? Secondly, let me again thank our major partners, Tanya Constable and the team at the Minerals Council of Australia, Mike Yeh and the team at Microsoft, and Paul Everingham and the team at the Asian Natural Gas and Energy Association. Thank you for putting your faith and trust in us to do this, and we really look forward to working with you again in the future. It's been a really rich experience to work with you on this conference, so thank you. There's a couple of areas where I think this conference broke ground. I don't know if another conference has had the FT as a media partner in Australia. I don't know, maybe. But I think that was a fantastic, again, vote of confidence in the work of the centre. And I want to thank Alan in particular for coming out from London and really setting the scene for us yesterday in what is a difficult, thorny, complex, elastic concept, as he referred to it yesterday as well. And one final plug, page 8 of the program has a QR code for a subscription to the FT, a discounted subscription, if you want to take that away. The other area where I think we broke ground is having 5 serving secretaries or agency heads of Australian departments at one conference. I don't know of any other one that's done that. So I want to particularly thank all of those friends of mine, actually, who I prevailed upon. And even Stephen Kennedy, you could tell he was pretty crook yesterday. But he got through it, and a very important speech. So we really appreciate all the secretaries and my good friend Andrew Shearer as well. again, I'm not going to go through yesterday. There's a couple of phrases out of actually Mike Ye's speech this morning that really registered with me because they sort of go to the whole where we are with economic security. I think he talked about a real-time dashboard of threat information. That sort of gave me flashbacks to COVID, actually, and what Prime Minister Morrison had to have on his desk every morning. But it does feel like we're sort of back in a permanent world of real-time threat information that decision makers need. And I think that's a challenge for all our processes and systems to be able to grapple with what is meaningful. And we've just done a little bit of work on risks. So how do we rank risks? How do we think about relative risks? And what are the things that we really need to put limited resources towards? The other term Mike used is trusted collaboration and interoperability. And I think that's the sort of path going forward in terms of the international partnerships of like-minded nations. So they were two things that really resonated with me out of today, and I want to thank again everyone who spoke today as well. I'm going to hand over to Mike now for his thoughts, but two books and one speech sort of popped into my head when I was thinking about what I'm taking out of today. One was having a rock star like Dan Jurgen, and we mentioned his book, The Prize, and the new map. But his first book, I think, was called Commanding Heights, which was really a story about the rise of free markets and globalisation. And it feels like we're at a little bit of an inflection point and we need a new big, maybe Alan, that's your next book, maybe a new version of where we are in terms of the global economy and a different form of commanding heights. I think that's probably what we're looking at. And we talked a lot about not just traditional areas like energy security, which are always going to be with us, but also the new areas that we're grappling with on technology. So the other book that came to mind was James Fallow's More Like Us, which was written at the height of US-Japan conflict that Mike worked on. And I guess I take from that that we have to, as liberal democracies, use our processes as best they are, which is really events like this. So open discussion and debate, trying to find a synthesis out of a contest of ideas, a marketplace of ideas, if you like. And when we make mistakes, course correcting, having the process in place that, having worked in a government that lost an election, you move on as liberal democracies and you course correct and you learn from your mistakes. So I think that's the strength of our system, and that's why I think we can copy someone's industrial policy if we like, but part of the solution is just being more like us as well. And finally, I'll be a poor man's Winston Churchill after Alamein. But this conference, I feel like where we've got to now is not the end, it's not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. So thank you.
Hi, I'm one of those people who tells you everything you've heard over the past 2 days. No, I won't do that. John asked me not to. I would make two quick observations, though. There is convergence. It's quite striking. If we had done this within a month of Jake Sullivan's Brookings speech, I think there would have been a lot more fighting of the idea of small yards, high fences. But everybody quoted it. Everybody, including Stephen Kennedy. That was interesting. And there's, yes?
I have to say, that actually comes from Bob Gates, not Jake Sullivan.
The original. The original. But nobody reacted to Bob Gates. They reacted to Jake Sullivan. Yeah. 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 But the convergence, I think you'd agree, Liz, is really quite striking. And also the way we talk about it. You know, everybody had, the government officials in particular, some form of protect, promote, and partnerships across industry and the private sector with government, but also across key allies and partners. And there were some pretty obvious areas where we're not yet aligned. The discussion we had about the WTO and the system is not one that in Washington is happening very much right now. The Megan Quinn's admonition to stop talking and get on with it last night was really, really good. And you know, Emily also echoed that. There's some very concrete things government industry have to do around disciplining finding some disciplines around subsidies and industrial policy, figuring out economic statecraft in the region, creating market incentives around the minerals strategic partnership and so forth. There's some, it's time to get some work done, but the convergence is encouraging. My inner historian can't resist. History rhymes, it doesn't repeat, but I think we are at something of an inflection point, as John said with his Churchill quote. I think of the 1920s, when the Council on Foreign Relations was created, the modern Foreign Service and Foreign Commercial Service. In the 1920s, the Secretary of State and the Foreign Minister in Britain were able to talk by telephone. I mean, there was just an explosion of dialogue and norm setting, and nobody really understood the underlying power shifts that were happening. Hopefully we're not in that direction. And then if you've read Dean Acheson's famous Present at the Creation, that's another inflection point in history where, although there were American officials who wanted to ban baseball exports to the Soviet Union, there was an incredibly intelligent design around Bretton Woods and the system that we're now, in some ways, trying to preserve. We're not there either. So it'll be interesting to see where this goes. Hopefully this contributed to it. I have to thank Dr. John Kunkel. I don't know, John, if it was harder to be Scott Morrison's chief of staff during COVID or pulling together this conference. I'm guessing this was more fun, at least, because you got to go back to your ANU PhD and Peterson Institute days thinking about these issues. But many, many thanks to John. Haley Channer and the Economic Security Team for the ongoing work in this area and your leadership here, and to Jared and the polling team, and to Janine Pinto and all the USSC staff who made this happen. I'll end with a big thanks to them and to all of you. Thank you all.